They stole a loaf of bread and lost a hand. They gossiped in the marketplace and had their tongues pierced with iron, in a time when justice meant fear, pain, and public shame. The smallest mistake could lead to the most horrifying price. This isn't fiction. This was law. These were the punishments for the everyday people of medieval Europe, brutal, theatrical, and often final. From shame masks to boiling alive, you're about to witness 15 real punishments used to control society when fear ruled harder than kings. In medieval Europe, the idea of justice was not built on fairness, it was built on fear. Law enforcement, as we know it today, didn't exist. There were no professional police forces, no forensic investigations, and rarely any consistent legal process. Instead, justice was enforced by lords, bishops, or local officials, applying their own interpretation of order, often shaped by class, religion, and reputation. The system was fragmented, brutal, and deeply personal. For the average person, especially peasants living under feudal lords, there was little room for appeal or nuance. A simple accusation could lead to public flogging. A second offense might mean disfigurement. Repeat offenders were often executed, not because their crimes were uniquely evil, but because punishment had to be seen. Visibility mattered. Justice had to leave a mark on the body in the public memory. That's why medieval punishments were rarely hidden. Stocks were placed in the center of villages. Gibbets dangled from hilltops. Torture chambers were built beneath castles. But the results were dragged out into sunlight. A branded face, a severed ear, or a missing hand served as lasting proof that authority had acted. This wasn't just about retribution. It was about warning. A society ruled by monarchs and clergy used physical suffering as its loudest announcement. Disobedience comes with pain, and the consequences are not abstract. They are iron, fire, rope, and blood in some regions. Even minor crimes, like gossip or petty theft, led to horrifying responses: tongue mutilation, amputation, or prolonged public humiliation. These acts became rituals, often turned into public events. Spectators were invited, drinks were sold, children were brought to watch. Punishment was not only a sentence, it was theater, one designed to reinforce the power of the state, the nobility, or the church. At its core, medieval justice was not about reforming the criminal. It was about maintaining order through intimidation. The method didn't have to be fair or proportionate. It only had to be loud enough to echo. That's why these punishments weren't hidden in dungeons. They were displayed, repeated, and remembered. A system of control carved into skin, bone, and fear. In medieval Europe, theft was more than a crime. It was a threat to the fragile social balance. With no banks, no insurance, and little to no state protection, property meant survival. If a peasant lost his grain or a merchant lost his coin, there was no safety net. Punishment, then, had to be severe enough to stop others from trying. Across England, France, and the Holy Roman Empire, stealing even food could cost a person their hand. Mutilation was both penalty and message. The removal of the right hand, used for work and trade, ensured the thief would never offend again, and that everyone who saw them would remember why. In some regions, a first-time offense resulted in a public flogging or a night in the stocks. But a second offense could lead to permanent disfigurement in 13th century England. Under the rule of King Henry III, the legal code known as the of Clarendon made clear distinctions between petty and grand larceny, but both carried harsh consequences. Stealing anything valued above a few shillings could be punishable by death. For lesser thefts, branding was common. A hot iron marked the thief's flesh often with the letter T, scarring them for life. It was used not only to shame, but to catalogue repeat offenders in a time when there were no police records. The practice wasn't confined to the lower classes. Even nobles caught stealing or defrauding other lords risked land seizure, forced exile, or public humiliation. But for the poor, the punishment was far more physical. In 14th century France, under Philip VI, numerous edicts ordered the hands of thieves removed in marketplaces. The punishment was often carried out immediately in front of the public, using crude blades heated in fire. The cultural logic behind this brutality was tied to deterrence. In towns where resources were scarce and poverty widespread, the law relied on fear. Justice was not meant to rehabilitate, was meant to remind, and the reminder had to be visible. Theft was also considered a betrayal of social order. In a feudal system where everyone had a role, stealing disrupted the chain of obligation between lord and vassal, between peasant and neighbor. So punishment had to be more than punitive. It had to be symbolic. A severed hand, a branded face, a public whipping. These weren't just acts of retribution. They were warnings carved into flesh, meant to last longer than the crime itself. In medieval Europe, morality was enforced not only through religion, but through spectacle. Adultery, gossip, lewd speech, these weren't private matters. They were crimes against social order, punished publicly, often with humiliation rather than blood. But humiliation could be just as damaging, and in many cases, it was designed to be permanent. The scold's bridle was one such tool, originating in Scotland and spreading across parts of England and Germany by the 16th century. It was a metal cage locked around the head. Inside the mouthpiece, a sharp iron plate pressed down on the tongue, sometimes with spikes. It wasn't just to silence it, was to cause pain with every movement of speech. Women accused of nagging, quarreling, or speaking too freely were forced into the bridle and paraded through town. The device could stay on for hours, even days. As they were led through marketplaces while crowds jeered, iron masks were another variation, often grotesquely shaped, some like animal heads, others carved with demonic faces. They were clamped onto those found guilty of adultery or other moral failings. The point was clear: shame had to be worn. These devices weren't made in secret. They were forged by blacksmiths and displayed in town halls or parish storage, ready to be used when morality was breached. The pillory, perhaps the most iconic form of public shaming, was used across Europe throughout the Middle Ages. A wooden frame with holes for the head and hands. It immobilized the offender in the town square. Unlike execution or flogging, this punishment was slow. Victims could be held for hours, sometimes full days. Passers-by were encouraged to throw filth, spit, or shout abuse. For women accused of infidelity or prostitution, the pillory wasn't just punishment, it was a stripping of identity, status, and dignity. Gender shaped the application of these punishments. Men were certainly not immune to the pillory or stocks, but women were disproportionately targeted for speech and sexual behavior. In England, scolding was classified as a disorderly behavior nearly exclusive to women. Records from 14th century York and 15th century London show dozens of cases where women were subjected to the bridle, but almost no equivalent for men. The idea was to control speech, behavior, and appearance, all under the label of preserving order. Public shaming was a tool that required no executioner, no gallows, It weaponized community judgment, and once it was done, the punishment wasn't over. The memory remained. The whisper of accusation, the lingering nickname, the loss of reputation, a scar that never bled, but never really healed either. In medieval Europe, religion was more than belief, was law, order, and identity. To question doctrine was to challenge authority itself, and in an age where church and crown often worked hand in hand, that challenge could end in fire. Heresy, unlike other crimes, didn't always involve an act. It could be a word spoken, a book read, a silence kept when the church demanded allegiance, and the punishment wasn't just meant to correct it, was meant to eliminate. Burning at the stake became the preferred sentence for those found guilty. Not because it was the most efficient, but because it was the most public. The Inquisition formalized this process, launched in the 12th century and expanding across France, Spain, and Italy. It was designed to root out deviation from Catholic doctrine. At first, it targeted known sects like the Cathars and Waldensians. By the 13th century, under Pope Gregory IX, inquisitors were granted sweeping powers. They could investigate rumors, extract confessions under torture, and deliver people to secular authorities for sentencing. The Church often avoided issuing the death penalty directly, but in practice, the result was the same. The case of Jan Hus is one of the clearest examples. A Bohemian theologian and reformer, Hus criticized the moral corruption of the clergy and questioned the authority of the Pope. He was summoned to the Council of Constance in 1415 under a promise of safe conduct. But once there, he was arrested, declared a heretic, and burned at the stake. His death sparked outrage and rebellion, but the message from the Church was unflinching. Theological defiance would not be tolerated. Inquisitions didn't stop at scholars. Peasants, merchants, and even children could be accused. A single denunciation was often enough to launch a trial. In Languedoc, southern France, during the Albigensian Crusade, entire communities were investigated. Some confessed under duress. Others were executed without any clear understanding of what their heresy even was. The process was opaque, and intentionally so. Fear kept the faith intact. Monks weren't exempt. In 1318, a Franciscan friar named Peter Olevi was posthumously condemned for his teachings on poverty and papal authority. His followers were hunted down, interrogated, and many imprisoned or executed. Even within the Church, ideological divergence was seen as a threat. Burning served more than a punitive purpose, erased. Heretics were rarely buried in consecrated ground. Their writings were destroyed. Their names, if remembered at all, were accompanied by warnings. The execution site became a stage, with sermons preached as flames rose, reminding spectators that deviation brought damnation. Heretics were not always rebels in arms. Sometimes they were simply readers, thinkers, or critics. But in the eyes of medieval authorities, their thoughts alone made them dangerous enough to die. In medieval society, speech could be as dangerous as any weapon. Gossip, slander, and rumor weren't seen as petty offenses. They were viewed as threats to order, honor, and control. And in a world where reputation meant survival, the spoken word carried consequences that went far beyond insult. Punishment for verbal offenses was often brutal and deeply symbolic. The tongue, the source of the crime, became the target of the sentence. One of the most severe penalties was tongue removal. In parts of medieval Germany and Flanders, persistent liars, or those accused of blasphemy, faced amputation of the tongue, carried out with knives or heated tools. The procedure was rarely clean and often fatal due to infection or blood loss. But the point wasn't medical. It was theatrical. A mutilated mouth served as a walking warning. Other times, the tongue was pierced with iron. In England and France, blacksmiths were commissioned to create tongue studs, often with hooks, which were forced through the organ and left in place for hours or days. The pain was constant. The humiliation, even more so. The gossip's bridle, or brank, was another common device, particularly in Scotland and northern England. Built from iron, it enclosed a head like a cage, with a flat metal plate that pressed down or spiked into the tongue. Women accused of gossip, scolding, or speaking out of turn were forced to wear it in public. Townspeople were encouraged to jeer, follow, and sometimes even strike the wearer. It didn't matter if the accusations were true. In many cases, a woman could be sentenced simply for being loud, critical, or outspoken. These punishments were rarely applied to men. Verbal control was seen as a female transgression, tied to fears of disorder in the home and community. By silencing women, authorities reinforced a strict hierarchy. Obedient wives, quiet subjects, loyal followers. The obsession with controlling speech wasn't just about manners. It was about suppressing dissent, enforcing gender roles, and preserving authority. The tools used to punish it sharp, cold. Public made sure the silence would be remembered long after the pain had passed. In medieval Europe, the forest wasn't just wilderness, it was property. And in most cases, it didn't belong to the people who lived near it. Vast stretches of woodland across England and France were declared royal or noble preserves, protected under strict forest laws that served one purpose: to keep game as deer, boar, and birds of prey served for the elite. Poaching, even out of hunger, was a serious crime. A peasant caught hunting a rabbit or gathering firewood in royal woods could face penalties that ranged from mutilation to execution. The crime wasn't judged by what was taken, but by who it was taken from. The English Forest Charter of 1217, a companion to the Magna Carta, acknowledged the severity of these laws, but did little to soften them. Under Henry III, poachers risked the loss of an eye or hand. In some cases, both. The penalty for killing a royal deer, what the records often called venison of the king, could be death by hanging. And this wasn't just enforced in theory. Between the 13th and 15th centuries, dozens of executions were recorded for illegal hunting, often carried out in the same forests where the crimes had occurred, to serve as a warning. In France, under the Capetian kings and later the Valois, the approach was similar. Royal forests such as Fontainebleau were guarded by specialized officials, known as Motters des Oet, Forats masters of water and woods, who maintained strict control over access and usage. Anyone caught hunting without permission faced harsh justice. Surviving French legal records from the 14th century include cases of shepherds, blinded for setting traps, and woodcutters, whipped publicly for gathering branches. The logic behind these punishments was rooted in hierarchy. Forests were a symbol of nobility, and hunting was a privilege, not a necessity. To trespass was to disrespect that order. That's why even a starving man killing a hare could be treated as a political act. Justice didn't factor in intention. Hunger didn't matter. The law existed to protect the status of landowners and to remind the lower classes that survival did not give them the right to break it. Blinding a man for stealing. A deer sent a clear message. The king saw everything. and those who stole his sight would lose theirs in return. In the medieval mindset, poverty was not just a condition, it was a suspicion. To be poor without land, without work, or without a master was to be dangerous. Wandering beggars, traveling laborers, and the homeless were often lumped together under one label: vagrants. And vagrancy, in many parts of medieval Europe, was a crime by the 14th century. As plagues and wars displaced entire populations, local authorities grew anxious. With limited resources and little infrastructure, towns saw mobile poverty as a threat to order and stability. Instead of addressing its causes, they punished its visibility. In England, laws against vagrancy intensified following the Black Death. The Ordinance of Labourers in 1349 and the Statute of Labourers in 1351 made it illegal to refuse work or travel without permission. These laws aimed to tie peasants to the land and preserve the labour force, but in practice they criminalised survival. Those found wandering without proof of employment could be arrested, whipped through the streets, or branded. Branding was literal. The letter V for vagrant was seared into the flesh, sewn on the cheek or forehead. It wasn't just a punishment, it was a permanent marker. A man could never hide his past. A woman, already vulnerable to exploitation, was made more so. Some jurisdictions even mandated ear clipping for repeat offenders' disfigurement as legal status. Whipping was common, public, and ritualized. A vagrant caught in town might be tied to a cart and dragged through the market square while flogged with rods. Townspeople were expected to watch. The procession served as a lesson. Poverty would not be tolerated, and those without roots would not be welcome. In France, similar policies emerged under royal and municipal edicts. Parisian records from the 15th century describe patrols assigned to clear out beggars ahead of royal visits. Those who couldn't prove a trade or residence were expelled or punished. No crime beyond existence was required. Poverty itself became the offense, and once marked by scar, letter, or loss of blood, the poor carried their sentence with them from village to village. The system was not designed to help, but to push the unwanted out of sight, and in doing so, it turned desperation into criminality, and survival into evidence of guilt. In medieval Europe, money wasn't just currency, it was royal authority cast in metal. Every coin carried the face or seal of a king, a queen, or a noble house. To tamper with it was to tamper with power itself. That's why counterfeiting wasn't treated as theft, it was treated as treason. The crime came in many forms. Counterfeiters forged entire coins using base metals like tin or lead, sometimes plating them with silver to fool merchants. Others engaged in coin clipping, shaving small amounts of precious metal from the edges of real coins and melting the scraps for profit. Both acts, though seemingly minor, were considered an assault on the realm's economic stability. The penalties were designed to be shocking. In 13th century England, under the rule of Edward I, dozens of Jewish moneyers were arrested and executed. For alleged coin clipping, the punishment wasn't discreet. Many were hanged. Others were burned. In 1278, one of the largest mass executions for counterfeiting in English history took place in London. Over 280 people were implicated. At least 50 were executed. Boiling was another method used for counterfeiters, particularly in France and the Holy Roman Empire. Unlike hanging or beheading, boiling was slow. The criminal was often lowered into a cauldron of water, oil, or lead. In 1531, during the reign of Henry VIII, A man named Richard Roos, accused of poisoning, not counterfeiting, was boiled alive at Smithfield. Though his crime differed, the same law was later applied to counterfeiters due to its power to draw a crowd and deliver a message. The reasoning was political. A forged coin was not simply fake, it was seen as an attempt to dethrone authority. Just as a traitor sought to undermine the monarch with words or force, a counterfeiter did so with metal, and so the punishment had to fit the charge. A public execution that was visible, painful, and memorable. Burning was often reserved for repeat offenders, or those who operated large-scale forgery operations. The sentence typically followed a trial in a local court, though many records suggest verdicts were decided long before the gavel struck. Currency crimes weren't rare, especially during times of famine or inflation. But the punishments remained disproportionately severe, not to balance the books, but to remind the public that the image stamped into each coin was sacred, and those who dared to corrupt it would be erased with fire or steel. In medieval England, no crime was punished more brutally than treason. It was considered the highest offense, not just against the king, but against the entire order of the realm. And for that, the sentence was meant to erase both the man and his memory. The punishment was hanging, drawing, and quartering. Reserved for men convicted of high treason, it was as much a ritual as it was an execution. It began with the accused being drawn, tied to a wooden hurdle, and dragged by horse through the streets. This wasn't just transportation, it was degradation. The condemned was pulled over cobblestones and mud, often bruised and bloodied before ever reaching the scaffold. Then came the hanging. Unlike a typical execution, the rope was not meant to kill outright. The victim was hoisted just high enough to strangle, limbs flailing, face purple. But before death arrived, the rope was cut. Still conscious, the man was disemboweled, his stomach slit open, intestines pulled out slowly and burned in front of him. In some cases, his genitals were removed. The goal was not speed, was suffering. It was public, theatrical, and designed to make rebellion unthinkable. The final act was the quartering. The body was beheaded, then sliced into 4 parts. Each quarter leg, arm, torso was sent to different cities, mounted on spikes or displayed at gates. The head was often boiled to prevent decay, then impaled on London Bridge or above the city walls. A warning visible to all who entered. This method was formalized under Edward I in the late 13th century, especially during his campaigns against the Welsh and Scots. William Wallace, hero to some, traitor to the crown, was subjected to the full ritual in 1305. His limbs were sent to Newcastle, Berwick, Stirling, and Perth. His head remained in London, a silent message to any who questioned English rule. The brutality served a political purpose. During periods of unrest, civil war, peasant uprisings, succession crisis, the state needed more than laws. It needed fear. The execution wasn't just a sentence, it was a statement. To betray the crown was to forfeit not only life, but dignity, legacy, and body. The punishment persisted for centuries. It was used on the Gunpowder Plot conspirators in 1606. It echoed through the trials of Catholic martyrs, rebel lords, and foreign spies. Not until 1870 was it officially abolished in Britain. Hanging, drawing, and quartering was never just about justice. It was control through horror. Authority made visible one dismembered body at a time. In medieval Europe, when the law failed to explain the unexplainable, superstition filled the void. Accusations of witchcraft and sorcery weren't reserved for dark rituals or secret pacts. They often began with a failed harvest, a sudden illness, or livestock dying without cause. Fear turned suspicion into justice, and that justice relied not on evidence, but on ordeal. Trial by ordeal was a method meant to expose guilt through divine intervention. If the accused was innocent, God would protect them. If not, their injuries or death would confirm the crime. The ordeal of water was one of the most widely used. The accused, often bound at the wrists and ankles, was lowered into a body of water, typically a river or pond blessed by a priest. Floating was a sign of guilt. The water, seen as pure, rejected the witch. Sinking meant innocence, but few survived the exoneration. Drowning was common and often ignored. The Church claimed it had outlawed the practice by the 13th century, but records show it continued well into the early modern period, especially in rural villages where fear outweighed canon law. Fire was another judge. The ordeal of hot iron required the accused to carry a heated bar or walk several paces barefoot across red-hot plowshares. The wound would then be bound and examined after 3 days. A clean, uninfected burn meant innocence. A blister or festering sore confirmed guilt. The outcome was almost always predetermined. In many cases, the priest or local magistrate who judged the wound had already decided the verdict. These ordeals weren't limited to women. While the later witch trials of the 16th and 17th centuries disproportionately targeted women, earlier records show men, including monks and peasants, were also subjected to supernatural accusations and tested by ordeal. In 1143, a Benedictine monk in France was forced to undergo the hot iron test after being accused of heretical sorcery. He survived the ordeal but was later excommunicated on other grounds. The lines of authority in these cases were blurred. Local lords enforced the sentence, priests sanctified the process, and villagers carried it out. Justice was a mix of religion, fear, and rural tradition, none of it standardized, all of it deadly. Whether by fire or water, the result was the same. Trial by ordeal did not reveal the truth. It revealed power, and in the shadow of superstition, it was always the powerless who paid. Inside the stone walls of medieval monasteries, punishment took a different form. It wasn't loud, it wasn't public, but it was no less severe. When crimes were committed by members of the church or within its institutions, justice didn't come from gallows or branding irons. It came from within the cloister itself, ecclesiastical. Punishment prioritized correction over spectacle, yet the methods were harsh. Monks who violated their vows, whether through theft, sexual misconduct, disobedience, or heretical speech, were often sentenced to silence, starvation, or confinement. In Benedictine and Cistercian orders, the rule was clear. Discipline must be swift and humbling. Isolation was common. A monk might be confined to a stone cell, often without light or bedding, for days or weeks. Meals, if given, consisted of bread and water. Communication was forbidden. In some cases, offenders were chained to columns in the cloister walk or made to pray prostrate in the chapter house while others passed by in silence. Flagellation was also widely practiced. Whipping wasn't performed by executioners, but by fellow monks. It was both ritual and punishment. In England, monastic records from the 12th and 13th centuries describe disciplinary whippings for monks who overslept, hoarded food, or questioned authority. In France, the Abbey of Cluny kept strict internal registers of penances that included lashes administered over several days. The Church claimed these punishments were spiritual remedies, unlike secular courts, which branded or mutilated monastics. Discipline focused on repentance and the cleansing of sin. But the suffering was real, and the control absolute. Unlike lay criminals, monks could often avoid secular justice by appealing to canon law. This immunity, known as benefit of clergy, created tension between church and crown. A man accused of theft or even murder could escape civil trial by claiming clerical status, which transferred him to ecclesiastical courts where sentences were usually far lighter. In theory, the church punished the soul, not the body. In practice, the lines blurred. Cloister walls hid not only prayers, but pain. In medieval Europe, childhood ended early. By the age of 7, a child was considered capable of moral understanding, and therefore legally responsible for their actions. From that point on, the punishments they faced often mirrored those of adults. Public whippings, hard labor, even execution. English court rolls from the 13th and 14th centuries record cases of children as young as 8 being tried for theft and sentenced to flogging. At 10, a boy might be branded. By 12, he could be hanged. In 1231, a 12-year-old named William Fitzosbert was executed in London for theft. No mitigation was offered for his age. The logic was shaped by canon and secular law alike. The Church viewed age 7 as the threshold for understanding sin. Secular courts followed suit, enforcing penalties that assumed the child not only knew right from wrong, but chose the wrong. Intentionally, public lashing was among the most common. Sentences, administered in town squares or on market days, it served as both punishment and warning. Parents were sometimes ordered to witness, reinforcing discipline within the household. In some cases, the child was paraded before the flogging, shamed, before punished. For minor crimes like begging, trespassing, or petty theft, children could be sentenced to forced labor. Noble households, guild workshops, or even monasteries took in convicted minors as servants or apprentices under strict conditions. These arrangements were rarely acts of charity. The work was grueling. An escape meant rearrest or worse. Executions of children, while rare, were not exceptional. In 1466, a 13-year-old girl in Flanders was burned for arson. In 1321, a boy of 10 was reportedly hanged in Kent for stealing bread. Such cases reflected a legal system more concerned with deterrence than rehabilitation. In the medieval world, mercy was not granted by age. Judgment came early and it came hard. In medieval Europe, justice was more than lot, was performance. Execution days weren't hidden behind stone walls. They were staged in open fields, town squares, and market crossroads. Not only permitted, were encouraged to be watched. Authorities understood the power of fear, but they also understood the power of theater. Public executions became social events. Notices were spread days in advance. Markets stayed open longer. Vendors sold bread, ale, and fruit near the gallows. Children were brought to watch, sometimes seated on their father's shoulders for a clearer view. The message was intentional. This was justice, and it belonged to everyone. The gallows stood tall, often on raised ground or scaffolded platforms. In London, executions at Tyburn, just west of the city walls, were legendary. Crowds stretched into the thousands. Processions led the condemned through the streets, accompanied by guards, priests, and jeering onlookers. A final confession might be shouted, but few listened for forgiveness. They came for punishment. Executioners were public figures, not just men of violence, but men of ceremony. They sharpened blades in full view. They tied the ropes. They delivered the blow or pulled the lever. Some, like France's Charles Henry Sanson, centuries later, became household names. In earlier centuries, their work was seen as essential, even honorable so long as it was done cleanly. Different punishments drew different crowds. A hanging for theft might gather hundreds. A burning for heresy or a quartering for treason, those brought entire towns. The more gruesome the death, the more effective the warning. Not just to deter the crime, but to affirm the strength of the state, the church, or the noble house issuing the verdict. Execution wasn't just about removing a criminal. It was about control. Fear was reinforced not with secrecy, but with repetition. Each death replayed the same ritual: crime, capture, sentence, spectacle. The outcome was always known, but the process had to be seen. Even in death, the body had purpose. Heads were spiked above gates. Corpses were left to rot in cages. Birds pecked at reminders of disobedience. Justice was designed to be remembered, not through law books, but through crowds, gallows, and silence that followed the final breath. By the late 15th century, the winds of punishment began to shift. The raw spectacle of blood and public torment, once central to justice, started to lose ground. Across Europe, a new way of thinking began to take shape, rooted in reason, reform, and the growing power of centralized states. The Enlightenment, which would reach full force in the 18th century, had early roots in the intellectual movements of the Renaissance. Thinkers like Erasmus, Montaigne, and later Cesare Beccaria challenged the old order. Beccaria's On Crimes and Punishments, published in 1764, condemned torture and public executions as both cruel and ineffective. His ideas spread quickly, influencing legal reforms from France to Prussia. But the transition wasn't immediate. In the 1500s and 1600s, executions were still widely practiced, but questions were growing. Monarchs began to assert more direct control over justice systems. Public violence, once a tool of feudal lords and religious authorities, became less useful in an age that valued state authority and bureaucratic order. The rise of prisons reflected this change. Confinement, once seen as pointless, became a means of correction. In England, Bridewell Prison opened in 1556, not just to detain, but to reform. Hard labor replaced the axe. Silence and discipline replaced the scaffold by the 18th century. Many European countries had reduced their use of public execution. France's last drawing and quartering took place in 1757 in Britain. The spectacle of Tyburn was abolished by 1783, moved behind the walls of Newgate. Punishment hadn't disappeared, but its purpose had changed. From deterrence through fear, to control through surveillance. From pain in the square to order behind stone walls. The body was no longer the canvas of justice. The mind and the institution now held the power. Medieval punishments weren't the product of chaos or personal vengeance, they were calculated. From severed limbs to public burnings, each act of violence served a purpose beyond pain. These were tools of authority, shaped not just by law, but by fear, spectacle, and obedience. They reflected a world where control was physical, public, and deeply symbolic. Justice in the Middle Ages was never just about crime. It was about reinforcing a hierarchy, one ordained by God, administered by kings, and protected by custom. The rich and powerful weren't punished the same way as the poor. Clergy could claim sanctuary. Nobles had their own courts. But for the commoner, justice came in whips, fire, or rope delivered in the town square. For all to witness, power needed to be visible. The body of the criminal became the message. Branding a thief didn't just mark him, it warned everyone else. Hanging a rebel wasn't about ending a life. It was about extinguishing defiance. Even the most brutal acts, drawing and quartering tongue removal, boiling alive, followed structure and meaning. They weren't accidents of history. They were performances of control, tailored to terrify. And yet, behind each punishment was a society struggling to maintain order with limited tools. There were no police forces, no standing armies of law. Fear was the most reliable form of regulation. Punishment had to be so cruel, so public, that the memory of it would keep the rest in line. Medieval justice shows how far a society will go. When obedience becomes survival, it reveals the cost of order when mercy is a threat, and control must be carved into the flesh of those who step out of line. Not random, not reckless, but systematic, designed to last, and impossible to forget.